Day of National Ag Week here at Primary Industries Education Foundation, and I'll just let the recording start. Sometimes it takes a little while. There we go. Yes, welcome everyone to the National Ag Week, Farmer Times here at Primary Industries Education Foundation, and fantastic to see some schools are logging in today, and it's fantastic to have Kent here as for presenting his wonderful story to do a forestry to us today. So I'll hand it over to Kent to start the presentation. Thanks, Kent.
Thanks, Luciano. I'll start sharing my slides and we'll see how we go from there. Fingers crossed, technology is on our side.
All good. And if you've got any questions along the way, please put your questions into the chat function. They're on the right, the bottom right of the screen. And we'd love to hear your questions as we go along.
So hello everyone, I'm Kent and I'm a forester here at with Vic Forests. So over the next 20 minutes or so, I'm going to sort of give you a bit of an overview about forestry. So I'll tell you a little bit what we do as an organisation, as an industry. I'll also be saying a little bit what my role is, as well as going into some detail about what timber is used for and the processes and things that we have in place to make sure that we are harvesting it sustainably. So first off, I'll start off a little bit about myself. I've always been a really keen outdoorsman. Been involved in scouting for the last 16 years or so, and I do hiking, kayaking, cycling. If you name it, I probably do it. So naturally, I wanted to find a job that would get me outside into the bush and enjoying our natural spaces. This photo here is of me embarking on one of my many hiking trips. You can see the trees in the background. That's up at Mount Kosciuszko. So I've done a bit of traveling throughout different areas within Australia, and I love just exploring the bushland. When I finished school, I did went and did university, where I studied more detail about forest and botanical sciences, so learning about plants. And then I did a little bit of a stint in the Botanic Gardens in Melbourne and Canberra before starting in forestry. I think my first time I started getting an interest in plants was actually when I was in grade 5-6. I remember we were given an assignment that we could do anything we wanted, and I picked a tree that was outside my house. I think it turned out to be a bit of a weed tree, but I was so intrigued by the scientific name, the Latin name, and from there the interest just grew. So where do I work? I work in Victoria in the Yarra Ranges, which is just east of Melbourne. And here we have some amazing forests. We have ash forests, which have species including alpine ash and mountain ash. Mountain ash is actually the tallest flowering plant in the world. We also have mixed species forests, which are comprised of a range of different species. Some names that you may or may not have heard of include silvertop or messmate or other stringy bark trees. What's a forest to do? It's a whole process, but I'm going to have a bit of a video playing, and I'll first, before we do that, who's ever been to a forest? What did you see, smell, or hear? Do the students or teachers want to chuck some stuff in the chat? Surely some of you out there. We've seen birds, we've seen trees, we've seen creeks. Yeah, there's a whole range of different things that we can see in our forests. So I'm going to play a little bit of a video here, which takes us through the process of forestry. Here we go. Tony's added some more from the Neville Boner School. So turtles, trees, smell of fresh air. Isn't that lovely? So here we're looking at a fully grown forest, but that's not where it starts. So we start off with seed. And seed that comes from our eucalypt trees is really, really small. It's about the same size as sand. When we put the capsules, we put them into this machine, which turns them around, and it gets all these fine sand-like particles, which are the seeds, out of the capsules. From there, we plant the seeds, and the trees start to grow. The trees that we grow take a long time. So there's some photos of 5, 10, 30 years. But from growing them as a seed to when we actually harvest, it's actually a 60 to 80 year process. Then when they are suitable size, we harvest them. And that's where our timber comes from. So you can see here, it's a bit of a coop that's been recently harvested against the trees that have been kept and retained. So it's a cycle. So we start off with our seeds. The seeds, we plant them and they germinate. Then we have to wait this extended period of time before we go to harvest. Because it does take quite a long time, there's a big scientific process, and we have to make sure we do lots of planning to make sure that we get it right. After we harvest it, we have to turn these round logs into square planks, because that's what we're able to use in everyday society. So here you can see photos of it being in a sawmill where it's being processed, and those circle logs are cut into planks. But it doesn't stop there. There's actually a whole process where you have to dry them to make sure that they sort of retain the shape. This varies between different species, and there's a whole process which goes into it. So we start off with the seeds. They grow up, and then we harvest them. But it doesn't end there. We then plant more seeds, and it's a circular process. So that's how we know it's a renewable material, because it's not a resource that's depleted. It's constantly grown and replaced. So what is it that I do? Well, I'm a planning forester. So my main role is to find areas in the forests that are suitable for timber harvesting. So this has a two-stage role. The first stage, we look on our computers and our mapping software, and we talk with our other colleagues and stuff, and we try to find areas using all this information about where an area might be that's suitable. Once we've worked out where we think an area might be, we then have to go out into the bush and check it. And when we're in the bush, we're looking for a whole wide range of values. These might be conservation values, so there might be different habitats that we want to protect. So trees with hollows, we want to make sure that we're not harvesting them, or there might be rainforest and we need to protect those areas. Or it might be more practical things like, how do we get the machinery in there, and is it going to cope if there's too much rock on the ground? And how are we going to get the logs in and out of a particular area that we're harvesting? And then once we've done that, we come back to our computer and we type up what we've seen in the field and write a bit of a report, which then gets passed to the next team, who are the foresters that do the actual harvesting. So I'll show you some of those maps that we've got. The maps that we've got on the right-hand side are really cool. What's happened is we've had either a plane or a drone fly over the area that we're interested in, and they use lasers and they scan the ground surface. Then that information is taken and we get really detailed maps. The top one is of the ground surface, so you can see where the gullies are and where the creeks are, and you've also and the topography. And the one below that is the actual canopies of the trees, so we can see how high they are. So the bright green, almost the yellow color, are the really, really tall trees, and you can see the areas that are blue have been recently harvested. Some of the other maps that we use are on the left-hand side are the different zones. So the red zones we try to protect, we protect and we don't go in them. The yellow zones we have to manage a little bit differently. And then the light green zones are the areas that we're allowed to harvest. And then we gather other information like aerial images, and we collect all the information that we collect when we're in the field on our mobile devices. So that's another set of maps that we use as well. There's so much cool tech in our industry. From the phones and the tablets, which I mentioned, we have our maps on. We also use a fair bit of drones so that we can sort of see and get a different perspective on the trees, as well as collecting aerial imagery so we can work out how many trees have been retained. From these machines, from these handheld devices, which track individual logs that scan barcodes and track them between the forest to the mills. So what is timber used for? Do you know any items that are made for timber? Is there anything that you can see in your classrooms? Put in the chat if you can. Daniel's class has tables and shelves. There's paper. The house is made out of the timber. Pencils, doors, so much. So here's some examples. A lot of buildings are made out of timber. There's actually been research done that shows that timber has like a calming effect, or it helps improve your mood. So that's why you'll often find it in your classrooms, and you'll also find it in libraries and places where you might want to wind down or relax, or you need to focus. There's a whole lot of other cool uses as well. Really fancy buildings in your playgrounds. Do a bit of sailing myself and sail wooden boats. In the corner there, I've got pallets. They might not seem really cool, but it actually comes from timber from our forests. And there's a special kind of pallets made out of the mountain ash and the alpine ash, because they're really durable, but they're also lightweight. So it's not often you get to find a timber that's both lightweight and durable, but we get that from our native forests here in Victoria. Not so much here locally, but there are some really cool novel uses of timber and wood, such as in Japan, they make noodles out of them. They also make clothes and cutlery, as well as other things that are made from the cellulose, which is the cellular structure that timber is made out of. But it's not just a modern thing, timber. It's been around for years and years and years. The Indigenous Australians used our local timber for tools and weapons, to carry things, musical instruments, transport and canoes. And here at Vic Forest, we actually work with our traditional owner groups as well. So if there's a canoe tree, we'll aim to protect that and make sure it's registered, as well as trying to find old campgrounds where sometimes we look for axe heads and other bits and pieces. So we work very closely with our traditional owner groups. So what is our timber used for here at Vic Forests? Well, if you look at a tree, you've got the trunk part, which is generally not many branches and very straight. And that's used for what we call high quality saw log, which goes into your furniture like your chairs and your tables, which you're seeing at school. Anything where appearance might be important. the next level up the trunk, you start getting lots of branches coming out. And it's still a strong timber, but it doesn't look quite as pretty. So that's used for structural things like the pellets, which I mentioned, but also used in building houses and that sort of thing. Then when you get right to the top of the tree, that's where it's not really much good as a log anymore, but instead it's pulped and goes to things such as paper and cardboard. I'm sure you use a lot of that in your schooling as well. So why is it important that timber is grown sustainably? Before we go into that, is there anything that your school is doing to try to become more sustainable? Some schools have food gardens, worm farming and recycling. Yeah, that's very good. Yeah, recycling instead of throwing everything into the waste. Yeah, fantastic answers. So we're going to go with another bit of a video here, and was having trouble with the audio earlier, but we'll see how we go.
This is our planet, Earth. The Earth is huge, and we share the oceans and the air with every living thing, all the other people around us, all the animals, and all the plants. We have to look after the Earth. After all, it's our home. The Earth is very clever. It has all it needs to keep healthy and for animals to reproduce and plants to grow. But we humans often do things that interfere with how the Earth works. For a long time now, humans have been making too much rubbish and pollution. That's why it's important to recycle, catch public transport, and always put your rubbish in the bin. It's not always easy to see pollution, especially if it's in the air. Air pollution is made from tiny particles called carbon dioxide. If you live in the city, you've probably seen smog in the sky. Too much carbon dioxide in the air is causing the Earth to heat up. This is called global warming. You may have heard people talk about it on the news. If we don't find ways to take more carbon dioxide from the air, then our world will become more and more polluted. It'll be harder for farmers to grow the food we eat, and animals will get sick too. So what can we do? Well, luckily the Earth has its own natural helpers that can take carbon dioxide from the air. Trees. Trees take in carbon dioxide through their leaves and store the carbon inside, in the wood. Then they release nice, clean oxygen for us to breathe. So forests and tree farms are not just great places for us to visit and for animals to live, but they're also giving us clean air. We can turn trees into all sorts of things. Houses, cricket bats, guitars or furniture. And the good news is, all that carbon they've absorbed still stays inside. How cool is that? In Australia, we're always planting more and more trees in tree farms, in native forests, and in our towns and cities. We always replace the ones that we use. So there are always more trees growing. And growing trees love carbon. So the more trees we can plant, the happier the Earth will be. Trees really can save the world. Hooray!
Trees are really cool, aren't they? But if we weren't using trees, what would we be using? Well, we've got materials such as concrete and steel, but they use much more carbon in their production, which is polluting our atmosphere in comparison to timber and trees, which take it out of the atmosphere, improving the air that we breathe. There's also things that like paper and cardboard, which you said in your schools you've been recycling. Some alternatives are plastic, many of which you can't actually recycle, or they stay in the environment for a long time. They don't break down like our paper and cardboard and timber products do. Did you know that timber can also be used as an energy source? Instead of using coal and oil, you can actually burn biofuel and timber products to get energy out of them as well. And because it's renewable, It means we always can get more of the resource instead of just taking all the time. So how do we ensure that what we do is sustainable? Well, there's lots of different things that we do, but one of them is monitoring. So we observe changes in our environment to make sure that we aren't having a negative impact. So here we've got some photos of me and a colleague who are doing some water testing, where we put a probe in the water and we get different readings. And we do that over a period of time before we do any harvesting and after, to make sure that we're not having a negative impact or changes. Another thing that we do pre-harvest is we do spotlighting surveys. So we go into the field with torches and infrared cameras and find threatened species that need protecting. And if we do come across these species, we retain those areas and we make sure that they're protected. The photo there is of a couple of greater gliders that we came across doing some of these surveys. We also look for threatened species of plants, as well as also looking at heritage things. So we, as I said before, we work with our traditional owners for Indigenous sites, but also European settlement sites as well. So if there might be old mines or old timber mills that we need to take into consideration when we're doing our planning. So we take on all these different values that we come across and we put them in our plan when we're planning an area for timber harvesting. But I think the most important aspect of showing that you're sustainable is that we regrow our trees. As we said earlier, it's a cycle. So we harvest, but then we regrow and replant to make sure that this resource is there and available for future generations to use. It's an interesting process, regrowing our forests here, because they're adapted to fire. So often what we'll do is we'll harvest, we'll burn the area, and then we'll put the seeds down, because that makes an active seed bed and more likely for them to grow successfully. And there's different measures that are done to make sure that we've done everything right. So we have people come in and check on us, and you get different levels of certification to prove whether an item is manufactured sustainably. So if you look at some of your timber products around you, often they come with like on the back of the packaging, it might say certification. So next time you grab a piece of paper, have a look at the back and it will tell you if it comes from a renewable source of timber. So I've given you a little bit of an overview about what our industry does, what's timber used for, how it's sustainable. There's so many different opportunities in the timber industry. In the top left-hand corner, that's a plantation aerial view, so where the trees are planted in rows. So that's a little bit different to what I do, where we work in our native forests. We also do a lot of things with fire, so trying to help with bushfire management, as well as I said before, coop burns when we're replanting. In the bottom left-hand corner, we do community engagement and talking to groups and schools like yourselves. I think in that photo, we've got a group of year 11s and 12s, but we also work with uni students as well, which is always interesting. And there's a whole lot of tech and mapping and software that we do as well. So it's not all just walking out of the bush. That's a large part of it, but there's all these different things that come involved as well. So that's my presentation done. Now, hope you've enjoyed it. We'll see if there's any questions about what I do or about the native timber harvesting here in Victoria, and I'll see if I can answer them for you.
Yes, if you've got any questions, please put them in the chat box. And that was fantastic, Kent. Some really, really good information there about the forest that you work with. There's so much to know, and it sounds like a really fascinating career and job that you've got. Here's a question from Tony. Can forests that have Pinus radiata be returned to native forests?
I think it's something that can be done, but I know the pine, they do sort of impact the soil composition a little bit. So it's something that would take quite a long period of time to do. But yeah, as I said, the forest that we grow, it's a 60 to 80 year sort of scheme of things. Not too sure what work's been done in that, but yeah, I don't see why there's any reason why it couldn't be. It might just take a while for that soil chemistry to sort of revert back to what it used to. So it might be a bit of a gradual process.
That's a great question. I've got another question here from Daniel. What happens when there's a bushfire?
That's a really good question because it actually varies depending on what type of forest you're in. So we've got some species of trees, like our alpine ash and mountain ash, which are very sensitive to fire. So what happens is the trees often get killed. And then what we try to do is, because those dead trees are still a resource, but we have to make sure that we harvest them within a year before they dry out too much. So we try to do that. But when those trees get burnt, they let out a whole lot of seed at once and they regrow from the ground up. It's a bit different from our mixed species forests, where the trees are much more durable. They've generally got thicker bark, so they can protect themselves from the trees, from the fire. And then they tend to shoot all these new regrowth along the sides of the trunk, but they're not killed like the ash trees are.
Fantastic answer there, Kent. Another question from Tony. What sorts of different tree species are used for timber in the Yarra Valley?
So there's a number of different species. The most prized species are probably your mountain ash and your alpine ash, because ash, they grow really tall and straight, so they're perfect for timber, but also got properties like they're lightweight but really durable. We also have other species like messmate and silvertop and brown stringy and mountain grey gum. There's a long list of them, and I could probably go on for a while naming them, but they're probably the main ones.
Fantastic. Another question from Daniel. Do you only cut down the trees that you purposefully plant to cut down?
No, so that's the difference between sort of the plantations versus our native timber harvesting. So a lot of the areas that we harvest are areas that were actually previously killed or wiped out in fires back in the 30s and the 40s. And we're only harvesting them now. But what we do is we make sure that the seed that we collect are from the same areas. So once we have harvested, we replace them with the same seed that came from that area.
Fantastic. Tony's got another question. How long have you been a forester? That's a great question.
I've been working with Vic Forest for 2 years. I'm still relatively new in the scheme of things. But yeah, I went through the university pathway where I studied it studied forestry for 3 years before that.
Wonderful. Another question from Tony. Do you also take care of the animals as well as the forests?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's why we do a lot of survey work, and there's a lot of planning that goes into harvesting area beforehand. So we make sure that trees that animals like, so big trees that have lots of hollows in them and lots of branches that sort of connect them to other trees, they can move around in the canopy. We try to protect as much of them as we can. And yeah, we do sort of monitoring after we've harvested to make sure that these refuges that we are keeping, that it is supporting the native wildlife, so we can always sort of make sure that we're improving our processes in the future.
Fantastic. And we've got another question here from Daniel. When you cut down plantations, does the carbon release again?
No, so the carbon dioxide that's the plants and the trees suck in is then converted into the timber. So once you harvest the timber, the carbon is locked away in it. And there you can release it. So if you burn the timber as firewood or something, it does release it back into the atmosphere. But otherwise, if you're using it for furniture or paper or stuff like that, it stays locked in it.
Fantastic. And Beth says 50% of wood is carbon from CO2 from the air. Wonderful. Thanks, Neville Bonner School. That's great. Daniel's got another question. How many trees do you cut down each year?
So I don't know the number off the top of my head, but I know it as a percentage. So it's 0.04% of the forest that's allocated to timber harvesting in Victoria is how much that we cut down. So of the trees we're allowed to harvest, that's 4 in every 1,000 trees.
Right. It's fantastic to know those sort of figures there. And Beth says that's 0.04% of the forest allocation to timber, 4 in every 1,000. Daniel has another question. How much carbon do trees need to live?
That's a good question, Daniel. Not too sure if I can know that one off the top of my head, to be honest. I guess if there's less sort of carbon, it would sort of mean their stunted growth, so they don't grow quite as fast, or they might not be able to put out as much seed. But I'm not too sure how much they require in order to live. But that's probably what a reduced amount of carbon would impact, how they would impact them.
Kent, have they done some research in measuring the amount of carbon dioxide trees need to grow in an optimal way? And in your forest, do you measure the amount of carbon dioxide in the forest as a measure of the growth of your trees?
So I definitely know there is research in that area. I'm not familiar with that research very much myself, but I know they do record the changes in the size of the trees with the readings of the atmosphere CO2 level. I think Beth's just put in the comments here that a mature tree absorbs 28 kilograms of carbon per year. And Forest Learning have some material to sort of support and for the youth. What was the second part of that question again, Luciano?
Oh, whether you measure the amount of carbon dioxide in your forests.
Yeah, so we've actually got a new team as part of our organisation, which are looking at the carbon capture side of forestry. Previously, we've been from my planning side of things. We sort of measure our trees based on their height and their diameter to work out how much log and how much product is in them. But we haven't really necessarily connected that up until recently to how much carbon dioxide is in the atmosphere. But it's definitely an area of forestry that's becoming much more prevalent.
Fantastic. And the Forest Learning resource is the tree carbon storage tape measure is fantastic. There's a link there to it. And Forest Learning can send you a teacher pack if you would like to do so. And we've got your contact details. But in the chat area, if you're interested in Forest Learning send you a teacher pack, please mention that in the chat area, and Beth will organise that for you. Daniel's got another question. What do you do with the leaves on the trees?
Yeah, definitely. So as I said, we use the trunk the middle section, and then the top for paper production. The leaves, they're actually put sort of tops of the trees, the very tops of the trees with the leaves, they're put and spread on the ground of an area that we've harvested, and they're actually burnt. And the reason they're burnt is because that sort of creates an active seed bed for when we plant seeds on top of it, because that's the way that our trees have evolved here in Australia. So yeah, even the leaves are used. It helps regrow the new forest.
Fantastic. All right, I think we may have reached the end of our session for today, and if there's no more questions there, and Beth's got a comment there. Mountain ash need an ash bed to germinate the seeds. Other tree species only need light gaps, and that's a great point, because I know that a lot of Australian species need different conditions and fire and ash and the like. So I guess it's knowing the needs of each of the species of trees. Isn't that right, Kent?
Yeah, absolutely. And we've got such a diverse range. That's we do so much planning and so much research into work out what species we've got in a particular area, so that we can make sure that we cut them down at a particular rate and seed them, and make sure that we've got enough retaining trees to support the area when it regrows into the future.
Fantastic. Fantastic. All good. And foresters are scientists and use science to grow healthy forests. Exactly. It really is a science, and it's and all the technology that you talked about, Kent, really makes that job of managing and monitoring and understanding your forest so much easier. And it's just it's so amazing how much technology is used and the drones to manage your forest, which is a real eye-opener. So we'll leave it there, and I'll say thank you, Kent, for your presentation today. It was sensational, and thanks to everyone for joining us today on the National Ag Week here at Primary Industries Education Foundation. And big thanks to Forest Learning and Beth for assisting with the presentation and the promotion of our events this week. Thank you so much, Beth, and thank you, Kent. And we will I'll stop the recording now, and